I appeal to you, says the Apostle Paul in our reading from the first chapter of 1 Corinthians this morning, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. Wow, that's a pretty tall order. But Paul is reputed not to have been married. Maybe that's why he thought perfect unity of minds was readily attainable. He never had a wife to challenge him on that notion or other notions. Even the most cooperative and happy of couples have their differences, don't they? Family members disagree with one another. Children against their parents, brothers and sisters against one another. Employees, students, citizens, organizations, whole cities, provinces, states, nations. Who among them can claim to have achieved perfect unity of mind and thought? Are differences and disagreements not simply part of who we are as human beings? Part of our nature, really? Perfect unity. Is this a pipe dream? What would we do even if we actually achieved it? Would it make life a little too perfect and perhaps maybe even a little dull? Is that why our culture would seem not only to tolerate but almost to celebrate those who are disagreeable, those who are rude or engaged in doing totally nonsensical things, say like Rob Ford or Justin Bieber or others like that of our day? Maybe these and other famous people are quite prepared and maybe even sometimes advised to reveal themselves as ready to go over the top, be out of control, because it contributes to a very definitive identity. It puts them on the front page. It sets them apart from the others. They appeal to disagreeable means because they know it grabs attention in ways otherwise not possible, and thereby moves them closer to an ultimate end. Or maybe, as our premier suggests, at 19 years old, Justin hasn't quite grown up yet. Whatever the case, it's interesting that ours is a society that is clearly not in pursuit of perfect agreement on all things among all people. I recall my sister-in-law, who used to write a column for the Toronto Star, which dealt with a very wide range of human interest issues, reflecting on the amount of so-called hate mail she would get in response to articles she had written. The writers of these letters didn't so much zero in on the quality or integrity of her writing as much as what they figured, well, as much as they focused in on their intolerance of someone else's clearly expressed point of view, which was different than their own. At the very least, a writer who gets mail of any kind would seem to have proof that people are at least reading it. Many a famous actor has reflected upon the reception of bad reviews as a publicity that beats no publicity at all. The 19th century Swedish dramatist Swinburne once perhaps aptly remarked, "Antipathy, dissimilarity of views, hate, contempt can accompany true love." So what is the Apostle Paul dreaming about here? Perfect unity. Perhaps to strive to be agreeable, one might nonetheless argue he was just referring to the church and those connected with it. Indeed, that would be a defensible argument, for he indelibly connects it to Christ in his final words. For the message of the cross, he says, is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. So unity is to be found in the saving power of God. Those words may be easy to say, but they wouldn't at first glance appear to be easy to live, at least not in the real world of multiplex ideas and perspectives. The world is filled with disagreement, dissension, contrariness, argument, and as we know, even at times, war. As many of you might know, the Presbyterian form of church government is based on a court system within which opposing positions can be aired and presumably resolved. The world of democratic and many other political systems of governments similarly fashion themselves as venues within which the peaceable working out of differences can be carved out. Is this not the intent of the United Nations? So what if we actually achieve this objective once and for all? Well, that really wouldn't be real life, would it? That wouldn't be life at all. Life is about tensions, being pushed and pulled and actually being the better for it sometimes, hopefully most of the time, isn't it? Now don't get me wrong, but imagine if everything is at peace. Everybody agrees with each other. Nobody has any issues. Well, then we'd know something was wrong, wouldn't we? Like stepping into the world of the Stepford Wives, where the terribly agreeable women happen also to be robots. Or the Truman Show, where life is just a little too sunny as it's actually managed from a control room booth just beyond the artificially designed horizon. So what are we to do with the real tensions in life? Are we to embrace them as positive negatives, or somehow be locked into an endless war to transform them into something we find more palatable? As many of you know, I've long been a supporter of public education. This isn't an arbitrary choice as much as it is a whole perspective about what one believes is good for society. The notion here, in brief, is that if you separate out interest groups, religions, cultures, racial and linguistic groups, to become familiar, no longer to become familiar with one another, you're contributing to dissension. To learn of the samenesses of other groups similar to yourself and their differences, aren't we all better off doing that? So-called Christian schools miss the point of Christianity in that Jesus mingled with people quite unlike himself, and deliberately so. The idea as a parent, if you pull your child out of exposure to people unlike themselves, in the long run is not only handicapping the child, having missed an opportunity for diversity, but also of being challenged by perspectives in the world quite unlike their own. As a theological student in courses in colleges, or in the courses that I took at Knox College in the Toronto School of Theology, I deliberately engaged in courses outside of my own college, ones beyond the Presbyterian variety. We had an inspired ethics professor at Knox College who deliberately took us to Jewish synagogues, mosques, Hindu temples. This is at the heart of any education that would even vaguely pretend to be rich in wisdom. Has a parent done their child any favor when they go out into the world without having ever met the wonderful Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and even atheist souls that are out there? I don't think so. Prejudice is most often born of ignorance and lack of exposure. Life is sort of strange, really. Often we learn from stuff we'd rather not do, and then when we've done it, we realize how impoverished we would have been if we had deprived ourselves of it. We would have been misguided to somehow hide ourselves from it, giving into the notion that we need to be protected from it. Perhaps we can easily see what Oscar Wilde meant when he said he disliked arguments of any kind and that he found them always vulgar and often convincing. The problem with preferring to immerse a child in a presumably Christian school is that in truth, that is a misuse of the term Christian. Schools aren't Christian, people are. And the notion that somehow the flooding of minds with a homogeneous, presumably Christian perspective is desirable misses who Jesus Christ is all about. In an essential sense, Christianity is an argument, really, between Christ and an indelibly diverse and wayward world, inclusive even of those that were to crucify him for what he believed and taught and lived. Jesus Christ is a force, a spirit, not just after he died, but while he was and is alive, and as the Son of God ever shall be. For centuries, preachers across the globe have been trying to help people contend with these opposing forces of life, not to ignore them or run away from them or even be afraid of them. There was a sermon delivered by a famous preacher, the late William Sloane Coffin. He was the minister of perhaps the premier Protestant pulpit in the United States, Riverside Church in Manhattan, New York City. I shared an excerpt of it with a group of elders this past week. It's actually on the internet on a site dedicated to this gifted preacher who happened to marry the daughter of virtuoso pianist Arthur Rubinstein. Coffin himself was apparently quite a competent pianist. Anyway, one Sunday he preached his sermon from the piano bench and began with the playing of a major chord. I'm tempted to ask John to do this for us. I think it was a C chord, harmonious and pleasant as it was. He announced that it was, and then what it was, and then he progressed to a dominant seventh. Then he played a minor chord, indicating that some people's lives are often like that. Then finally he arrived at a diminished chord which sounded relatively dissonant and in a sense unpleasant. And he said, "That's life." Life is like a discordant chord, but then he says it can resolve once again into that melodious, seemingly non-discordant major chord, sort of like a relief. That's what the Spirit of God can do for our lives. Life in all its splendor is never completely without discord and thoroughly harmonious. That's what in part makes it splendorous. I suspect Jesus himself would take issue with the Apostle Paul's notion that we are to expect that all should be in united, perfect agreement all the time, never discordant. Jesus probably wouldn't envision that of the church, let alone the rest of the world. Like Jesus Christ himself, it would behoove us to be realistic. You may remember Jesus himself ventured out into that dark and cold desert of his life where he didn't isolate himself or hide himself from even the devil. The truth incarnate confronted that reality, and who prevailed? In 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered perhaps his most famous sermon on Christmas Eve in Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation recorded it and included it as part of their Massey lecture series. It was actually the final lecture. Dr. King, at that point, with the so-called race riots out of control in major cities across the country, and the nation seemed to be in mindless battle overseas in Vietnam, King confronted the subject of a longed-for peace, the desire for a new and better rooted justice. And in the midst of this sermon, he made what I think is a rather key observation, and that is that however good the end we have in mind, that alone cannot justify any means of getting there. Much as our past, fast-paced society seems to accept the idea of justifying any means to get to the desired goal, Dr. King is saying, just a minute. Even peace never justifies killing others. There would be too high a price to pay, he says. And so Jesus urges, love your enemies. Or to put it in King's words, somehow we must stand up before our most bitter opponents and say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. If there is to be peace on earth and goodwill toward men, we must finally believe in the ultimate morality of the universe. Something must remind us of this as we once again stand in the Christmas of the season and think of the Easter season simultaneously, for the two somehow go together. And here we are, astride Christmas and Easter in this season of Epiphany. In our gospel lesson today from chapter 4 of the book of Matthew, we witness Jesus, in effect, calling forth his disciples. Notice the interview for the job is conspicuously absent. Notice these guys are from different family backgrounds. No doubt they have quite different experiences in life. Their expectations and even sense of what they believe to be best in life may not be precisely in line with one another. And Jesus nonetheless calls them. Imperfect as they are, discordant as they are, he calls them to go out into the world, a world pretty much like themselves, yet different from themselves, to deliver a love and an understanding and a spirit that is more than they know. Indeed, can we, aspiring disciples, not sing the chorus with Dr. King, I have a dream that one day men will rise up and come to see that they are made to live together as brothers. The lion will lay down with the lamb. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. And with this faith, we will be able to adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. Now that shouldn't just be a dream. Like the preacher's musical chords, isn't this real life? Amen.